Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. Today's program is part of the Presidential Primary Sources Project, and our program today is Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. It's being presented by the Theodore Roosevelt Birthplace National Historic Site. The Presidential Primary Sources Project is a collaboration between Internet 2, the National Archives, and the National Park Service. It's a free series we put on every year from January through April. This is just a quick reminder that by participating today, you are agreeing to be recorded and archived. We do keep all of our recordings on our YouTube channel so that teachers and students can access them later. All right, we're super excited to have you, and we absolutely want you to participate as much as possible. So if you haven't already found it, go ahead and look for chat, your chat box. It looks kind of like a caption bubble. That'll be a great way for you to ask questions, answer questions throughout the presentation. There's also an opportunity to be on camera. If you're interested in that, you can just go ahead and leave a message for me in the chat box, and I can help you do that. Again, we want you to participate as much as possible. It's more fun that way. That said, please be very respectful of our interactive tools. Make sure that any questions you're asking, any comments you're making, that they're all directly related to what our presenter is speaking about today. All right, and with that, I just want to thank you one more time. This is our website if you're interested in signing up for some of our upcoming sessions, which, as I mentioned, are every Tuesday and Thursday all the way through April. You can find information about those at the website. You can also find links to our recordings as well of our previous sessions. With that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and hand it over to Ranger Joe. You are muted, Ranger Joe.
There you go. I know. I was looking for the button. It just appeared. Well, I'm going to share a screen and then get started here. Share. And I'm going to go to slideshow and we're going to go to from beginning. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ranger Joe here talking to you from East 20th Street in New York City, the birthplace of Theodore Roosevelt. One of the numerous national park sites here in New York City. And we're going to learn a little bit today about Theodore Roosevelt's time with the Rough Riders. And it's an important time in his life. It was an accomplishment he was very proud of. And it's something he's often associated with. Very few people don't know or haven't heard of the Rough Riders. So hopefully we're going to give you a little more information about the Rough Riders and give you a little bit more insight into how he got there. So we are going to call this Theodore Roosevelt and the Spanish-American War because that's where the Rough Riders fought in that conflict around 1898. And I call it From Roosevelt to Rough Rider. Now we have some special items here at the house, which is one of the reasons why we talk about Roosevelt's time in the Rough Riders. The first picture that popped up there is one of his original riding gloves as an officer in a cavalry unit. He had leather gloves. This is one of them right here. The other one is over here laying flat. These are a pair of gloves that we have that he wore. Also, we have next to the glove this beautiful blue and white polka dot neckerchief. The neckerchief is kind of interesting. It became a kind of unofficial piece of uniform for the Rough Riders. Everybody in the regiment seemed to have one. The story goes that because of the extreme heat of San Antonio, Texas, where the Rough Riders were training, they needed something to tie around their neck to keep the collar of their uniforms from irritating their neck. And it said that TR found this blue and white polka dot neckerchief in the local general store. And when people saw him, when guys in the regiment saw him wearing it, they all wanted one too. So it became that unofficial symbol of the Rough Riders. Kind of cool. I have 3 of them. And finally, one of TR's uniform coats from his days as the lieutenant colonel and later colonel of Rough Riders. Theodore Roosevelt was an officer. As an officer in the Army, in the U.S. Army, you got a pretty good salary, and because of that, you, the officer, were expected to pay for your own uniform. Now it had to be the right design, but where you got it made, that was up to you. Well, TR was from New York City, and he was going to get a uniform made that he was proud of. So he went to Brooks Brothers, very prestigious uh, custom tailor here in New York City at the time. And he had at least two jackets made that I know of. This one here is at our museum, and there's another one at the museum in Oyster Bay at his home at Sagamore Hill. So we have these objects to look at every day, and it allows us to contemplate TR's time as a Rough Rider. Somebody noted that it looks kind of hot. You know what? Yeah, San Antonio was hot. They went from San Antonio to Florida. It was hot there. When they got to Cuba, it was hot there. And they were wearing these heavy, sort of canvasy, almost heavy, like heavy jean, same material that blue jeans are made out of, only not blue. And underneath that, they were wearing a blue wool shirt. So yeah, it was hot. And you see pictures of those guys, and I'll show you some. They always look like they're hot. Okay. Some things about TR, because, who is this guy we're talking about? He was born and raised in New York City. Here on 20th Street, he lived for 14 years. The family moved from here up to 57th Street when he was about 14 years old. When he lived here in this part of town, it was the very edge of New York City and kind of a rich neighborhood. That's because he was from a wealthy family. The Roosevelts had been in New York City before it was even New York City. They were Dutch, and the first Roosevelts came to New York City in the 1640s when it was New Amsterdam. They made their money first by selling regular old building supplies, kind of like a Home Depot almost. But by the time of young Theodore's era, the family business was now selling very fancy, very expensive imported glass. So the Roosevelts were glass merchants. TR himself was never in the family business. Uh, he was his first real grown-up job, I'll tell you about in a minute. As a little boy, despite being in a wealthy family, TR was very sickly. He suffered from severe childhood asthma. In a very dirty city like New York, that would have been very, very, very serious. And it was also the 19th century, and no one really knew what to do when one had an asthma attack. And they would often treat Theodore Roosevelt's asthma attacks when he was a little kid with weird things like tobacco smoke and small doses of strong black coffee, thinking that would help. It didn't. But he managed to survive it all to become, this very robust person that we kind of know about or think about. He went to school at Harvard. It was the first time he went to school out of the home because he was so sick as a child. All of his early schooling was at home, but eventually he would he would grow out of the asthma, and he was smart enough that he was able to go to Harvard. At the time, it was only a college. Now it's a university. He was married twice. Somebody asked me that earlier, and the way it worked out. While he was at Harvard, he met and married his first wife, Alice Hathaway Lee. She was a lady from a very wealthy Massachusetts family. Alice Lee would pass away around 1884 after giving birth to their first child. It was a devastating event in Roosevelt's life. He was very sad and upset. And a few years later, despite that, he did meet or re-meet, run into his former childhood friend Edith Kermit Carew, and they would reconnect. And he would marry Edith Kermit Carew in around 1886, and she would be the Mrs. Roosevelt for the rest of his life. He had 6 children, by the way. So people ask about that too. He was the father of 6, very proud father. enjoyed being with his children. If he wasn't able to play with them because he was out of town, he would write them all letters. His first grown-up job was New York State Assemblyman. He got elected right out of college and served at Albany for a number of years. When his first wife died, he left New York City for a while. He went out to the Dakota territories, where now North and South Dakota are, and he tried to be a cattle rancher. He wasn't particularly good at it, but he enjoyed living out on the plains and in the Badlands of the Dakota territories, and he became a kind of a cowboy, although he did have a Bowie knife from Tiffany, and somebody once called him a dude. His next job after coming back from his time out west, he became a civil service commissioner in Washington, D.C. He was definitely new there, and he spent a lot of his time seeing how the system worked and trying to fight what he's considered corruption. He got quite a reputation for that. He spent some time here in New York City as one of 4 New York City police commissioners. He got very famous for that. At the time, instead of just one commissioner, the city had 4, and their job was to oversee the police department. But he was the most energetic. He would come in at night and check up on to see if officers were sleeping on the job. He got quite a reputation out of that as well. After his time as a Rough Rider, he was elected governor of New York State, where he served for about a year, and then became vice president for William McKinley. Shortly after that election, McKinley was assassinated in Buffalo, New York, and Theodore Roosevelt became the 26th president of the United States, which is why we're talking about him. Now, I know some people ask some questions, and I feel like while I'm on this screen, I'll answer a few. Yes, going back, that uniform was hot, definitely. They drank a lot of water, but yeah, they also got dehydrated. They suffered what they called heat injuries while fighting in Cuba. Yeah, I mean, that was reality back then. Why did they wear them? Because they were in the army, and when you're in the army, you wear what the army tells you. That you don't have much of a choice. Also, somebody asked what his children's name were. Alice, Theodore, Archie, Kermit, Ethel, and Quentin were the name of his 6 children. Now let's move on. Let's talk about some Rough Rider stuff. The Rough Riders, as I said, were born out of the Spanish-American War. It was a very short war, and a war a lot of people don't talk about in American history that often because of its shortness. There was some activities or some motivations at the time. This was around the end of the 19th century that led to this war. First and foremost, as a country, we were concerned that Spain was the last of the old world, what we would call the old world countries, with really with colonies here in North and South America. You know, we fought the American Revolution against the English, and they kind of left. And by this time, Canada was a commonwealth, so it wasn't technically a colony. But Spain still had colonies. The closest one to us would have been Puerto Rico and Cuba, and Cuba's only about 60 miles from Florida. So we were concerned about that, the influence of the old world power here in the Americas. And like a lot of things, money is involved. There were natural resources in these colonies that we felt we should have more access to, perhaps, or at least the people who lived there should be able to do with it what they wanted and not just have to hand it off to Spain. Another reason, and this one is a little different, there was a kind of empathy. There was an insurrection, a kind of revolution going on in Cuba. Cubans were trying to get the Spanish out of Cuba, kind of like the way we did with the British back in 1776. And because of our experience with the British, there was a strong empathy. Americans could relate to the Cubans' revolution against Spain. We kind of felt like, yeah, we know what you're going through, and we wanted to help. And this, very important. This was the generation after the Civil War. Civil War was probably the most dramatic historic event up until that time in the United States. And there was a whole generation of young people who grew up listening to stories of the Civil War from people who were in it. Might have been their father, might have been their grandfather. And sometimes when you don't experience the thing firsthand, you only see the interesting parts. You only see the the romantic parts. It's like if when you watch a movie about the Civil War or about World War II, you think everything looks kind of interesting. And some people thought it looked fun. Yeah, I know it sounds weird, but this is what we're dealing with. So young people were looking for that same kind of excitement, and this was an opportunity to get that experience that they saw that their fathers and grandfathers had. They didn't realize how horrible it would be too. They'd find that out firsthand, and people wanted to be a part of something important. And maybe things felt a little kind of blah, and this seemed like something a little more exciting. And I see you got a question. Yeah, first of all, he was 40 when he enlisted in the Rough Riders, and he was in the Rough Riders for about a year and a half. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Uh, yes, there's always that excitement. And then suddenly the reality sets in. And with the Civil War and other conflicts in our history, the first time we ask for volunteers, there's lots and lots of volunteers. And then things happen and the war goes on for a while and not as many people volunteer anymore. And then you realize, oh, now we have to draft people. Spanish-American War didn't last long enough for them to have to draft anybody, but it happened in other conflicts in our history, definitely. The Cuban insurrection that I mentioned began, this is the last one, began in 1895. This is the island of Cuba. There's an inset of Puerto Rico and another inset of the Philippines. These are the three main pieces of land that were involved in the American conflict with Spain during that war. Most of the fighting occurred here in Cuba. There was some fighting here in the Philippines as well. Some naval battles also in the Philippines. It was over pretty quick. It was poorly planned, amazingly, and still it was over pretty quick. Now, the way the White House saw it in 1895, the president was Grover Cleveland. Excuse me. He was very serious about staying out of other people's business. He did not want to intervene with the revolution in Cuba, the insurrection. He occasionally would talk to the Spanish government and say, maybe you should try doing, giving some giving into some demands and maybe being a little less harsh on the people and kind of talk it out instead of fighting over it. When all was said and done, he handed the whole mess off to William McKinley, the next president. Now, the thing about McKinley, McKinley was a Civil War veteran, and he was the last president we ever had that actually fought in the Civil War. And in particular, he fought at the Battle of Antietam, which was very bloody single-day battle fought in September of 1862. McKinley had firsthand experience with war, and he was not trying to get the United States into another war. Somebody asked when TR was born. His birthday is October 27th, 1858. Okay. But there were things that were, besides the motivations, there were incidents, actions that would lead to eventually making war inevitable. One of the most prominent events was the incident with the USS Maine. Remember, the Maine became a sort of battle cry for the men who went to fought in Cuba. The USS Maine was an American naval ship. There's a picture of it in fit form, relatively new ship too. It was anchored in Havana Harbor one evening before the war, and it was pretty normal, quiet, and suddenly there was a loud explosion, and the ship was blown apart and sank in Havana Harbor. There were many casualties, and the reaction to that was instantaneously one of, we need to get back for this. The Spanish did this. There was a lot of accusations flying around. Uh, in particular, two journalists, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, uh, owned multiple newspapers, and they were just writing story after story about how this was the act of an enemy nation, and we need to somehow get revenge on it. The investigation on the incident were inconclusive for many years. The Spanish even offered to help us investigate it. Some people thought it was done on purpose using an explosive device. Others later on realized it may have actually happened because of a fire in the boiler room of the ship that was adjacent to an ammunition locker. So uh, when you look it up today, it kind of leans more towards the accidental cause, but at the time it didn't matter. People were pushing for it. It was an event that was serving people purposes, so they did what they did. Yes, a lot of people got hurt when that ship blew. There's a memorial to the USS Maine in Arlington National Cemetery. Now, between all those motivations and the Maine incident, we finally have what I call the clincher. This fellow right here, he's a Vermont senator. His name is Redfield Proctor, and he's going to go and take a trip to Cuba to find out what's going on there for, once and for all, and determine if there's really an issue going on that we have to be concerned with. And what Redfield Proctor finds out is pretty chilling. Uh, there's a policy used by the Spanish government during the insurrection called the reconcentration policy. Basically, what they do, because Cuba had a couple of big cities, but most people lived out in the country. And when people live out in the country, certainly in the 19th century, they're harder to track down. So all the insurrectos were out in the country using that kind of rural setting to their advantage. So what the Spanish decided to do was to get people who were living in the country, and it started in 1896, and move them from their country homes into settlements built in and around the cities. This was what the reconcentration was. The problem is you have now many more people in a small place than you had before. There are going to be problems with resources, with sanitation, and these are going to lead to issues. I'm looking at the chat here. Somebody asked a question that's actually pretty interesting. Going back to the Maine, it said, did TR obtain a gun made from the Maine? Actually, it wasn't a gun made from the Maine. It was a gun that was on the Maine. It was a revolver that had been issued to a sailor on the Maine. It was salvaged from the wreckage of the Maine. And someone who knew TR, do you remember TR was Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time? So he was able to get a hold of that gun, and he carried that gun with him when he was a Rough Rider. So now we move 1/3 of the Cuban population in and around all the cities. And the result of that is, well, it's devastating. Over 400,000 Cubans will die from disease, starvation. It's just not a good effective policy, and it ends up causing more concern on the part of the U.S. government, because now this is not a made-up story. This is a real story, and this is something that Congress, the Senate cannot tolerate. The pressure is on President McKinley to do something about it, and ultimately McKinley has to give the Spanish government an ultimatum, and the minute he does that, Spain declares war on the United States. Now, as a country, we didn't have a very large active military, and just like in the Civil War, they were going to depend on states to raise regiments to go fight in this war. Theodore Roosevelt, a New Yorker, saw this coming, and he went back to his home state of New York. He knew the governor, and he began to sort of campaign with that governor to get himself a commission in the New York National Guard, particularly the 71st New York. He had a feeling that that unit would be going off to fight the war. Now, the interesting thing is, at this time, Theodore Roosevelt is Assistant Secretary of the Navy, so he's pretty high up there. He doesn't have to do anything except keep working. He's got 6 kids, and he's 40 years old, so he's not, he's pretty much set. But he is determined to go fight in this war. He is offered a naval, he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, so the Secretary of the Navy said, "Do you want to be a naval officer?" And Roosevelt's response to that was, "I would be a waste as a naval officer." He had no interest at all in being a naval officer. He wanted to be a soldier. So he went to New York State Governor and asked for an officer's commission in the 71st New York National Guard. In the meantime, he had a very close friend, a doctor and professional Army officer named Captain Leonard Wood. They agreed on everything about the situation, and he was determined to help Wood also get a commission. And for Wood, it would be in the Massachusetts State Guard, because that's where Leonard Wood was from. They would be close friends for the rest of their lives. So he's calling up governor, well, he's writing to governors, that we call it anybody, and trying to get officers' commissions for himself and his buddy Len Wood. And they're basically told the same thing: wait your turn. Everybody is calling. Everybody's writing. Everybody wants to be an officer in these guard units. Everybody wants a chance to be a part of this. Somebody asked me, and it's a pretty good question, if he want to fight so badly because his father did not fight in the Civil War. It's an interesting. So he never says that directly. Theodore Roosevelt's father was active in the American Civil War on the Union side, but as a civilian. He never joined the Army. And in fact, when he was drafted, Theodore Roosevelt's father paid someone else to go in his place. Now, Theodore Roosevelt thought his father was the greatest human being that ever lived. He said that straight out several times. But his family, Theodore's family, his sisters, said that that one thing about his father bothered him. And there is a theory that because of that, he was trying to make up for that. And this is why he was so interested in getting in and fighting that war. There were a couple of things he said in his lifetime that kind of support that. One of the most interesting things he's ever said that I think supports that. He was exchanging letters in the early part of World War I with Rudyard Kipling, a very prominent English author and an important figure in the early First World War in England. And he said to Rudyard Kipling in a letter, "I'd much rather be in a position to tell people why I went than to have to explain why I didn't go." So he thought it was important. Some people would say Roosevelt loved war. I don't know if that's accurate. I think he did believe that service to one's country in time of war, certainly that was very important. So both guys were told, you got to wait. Well, they weren't waiting. And Secretary of War Alger gives them an option. He offers Theodore Roosevelt command of a newly raised cowboy volunteer cavalry regiment. Now they call it a cowboy regiment because the first U.S. volunteer cavalry was being raised in the Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma territories. So Congress automatically said, well, everybody there is a cowboy. So it's definitely a cowboy regiment. And since everybody there is a cowboy, it's going to be a cavalry regiment because everybody already knows how to ride a horse. Now, Roosevelt, and this is one thing I admire about him, he knew his limitations. When he was offered that command, his response was, let Leonard Wood be the colonel, be in charge. Wood was the professional soldier. Wood had experience fighting in the West earlier. Roosevelt knew he was not a professional soldier and he wanted to learn from Wood. So he said, Wood should be the colonel. I'll take the job as lieutenant colonel and learn from Colonel Wood. So he went as the second in command of the Rough Riders. Now here he is looking very Rough Rider. He's got that uniform jacket on and those gloves. And you can even see the blue and white neckerchief here on him. Somebody asked why he didn't want to be in the Navy. He didn't think he was qualified to be in the Navy. Interestingly, the first book he wrote, one of the first books he wrote was about the Navy, and he had relatives who had been in the Navy, but he himself didn't think that he'd be a good naval officer. Here he is in his uniform, the first U.S. Volunteer Cavalry. No one ever calls them that. They call them the Rough Riders. But they went through a kind of process when they were trying to figure out what their nickname would be. And here are some of the losers, some of the losing choices. And these nicknames were created by the press. Now, Roosevelt was already pretty famous at that point, so the press were always watching him. And because he was famous, everybody who could wanted to be a member of the Rough Riders and served with him. So, one of the early nicknames was Teddy's Terrors. Now, there's two problems with that. One, Theodore Roosevelt hated being called Teddy. He said that straight out. If you called him Teddy, it means you weren't his friend. People do. The press used to. But that didn't go over well. And terrorists, oh my goodness. Another one, Teddy's Toughs. Just a little bit better than Teddy's Terrorists, but again, he did not like being called Teddy. Another name, Rosie's Red Hot Roars. Whew. That's just a mouthful, ain't it? Nah, that didn't go over well either. I can't imagine him even thinking that was a good one. This one is interesting. Very, very posh. Rooseveltians. But it didn't fly very well. And what we have today was Roosevelt's Rough Riders, or simply the Rough Riders. Now, the Rough Riders were an interesting regiment. They were very diverse in their makeup, even though they were supposed to be recruited from Arizona and New Mexico and Oklahoma. Because Roosevelt was in charge of the recruitment and the second in command, people from all over the country wanted to be a part of it. People from the Northeast, fellows that went to school with Roosevelt, fellows that knew Roosevelt's family here in New York. So there was a really mixed bag of individuals. And we got some pictures here. Of course, here's TR standing. The gentleman here is Leonard Wood. That's his boss. The older fellow here is interesting. This is Joe Wheeler. Joe Wheeler was an old Confederate cavalry officer. This is years after the Civil War, and when this war started, he asked to join the Army, this time as a U.S. Army officer, and they gave him a job. He was in charge of the Cavalry Brigade in Cuba. Here's a picture of TR sitting around a bunch of Rough Riders, and you can see different kinds of uniforms. You see the khaki heavy coat uniform like the one we have in our collection. We also see the dark blue wool one. The one thing all of these uniforms had in common is that none of them were light enough to be wearing in San Antonio, Florida, or Cuba. This picture is actually a painting depicting one of the most famous incidents in the war, the kind of incident that got Roosevelt his reputation. Here he is. He's the only guy in the picture on horseback. And that's very interesting because the Rough Riders were a cavalry regiment. They were all taught how to fight on horseback. But the planning for the war was so bad, one of the things they messed up with was having a way to get all these horses with all these cavalrymen to Cuba. So they left the horses in Florida, and the only officers were allowed to bring their horses. This is the charge up Kettle Hill, the San Juan Heights. Roosevelt's the only guy on horseback, which means, well, he's the one the guys shooting at them can see. So this is a pretty dangerous place to be for Roosevelt, and yet he manages to survive. Let's see. Yeah, Roosevelt had his uniform made from Brooks Brothers. I mentioned that earlier on. They only recently, well, actually, they're still online, but we used to have a Brooks Brothers shop right down the block from our site. Kind of cool. Yeah, there was a lot of poor planning in this conflict. The Rough Riders had about 6 weeks of training. When they got to Florida, which is where they got on boats to go to Cuba, there weren't enough boats. When they got to Cuba, they couldn't dock the boats anywhere. So the ships had to be offloaded by launches, small boats. And the way they got the horses, with little horses they brought along, the way they got them off the boats, they dropped them in the water and kind of scared them into swimming towards the land. So yeah, it was bad planning all around. He recruited soldiers from literally everywhere. Soldiers were coming to him in Washington and asking to be a part of it. Soldiers were coming to him in New York and asking to be a part of it. And soldiers were coming to San Antonio, which is where the Alamo is, and signing up for it. Very interesting mix of guys in the Rough Riders. This is my favorite Rough Rider picture after Kettle Hill. You can see everybody looks really hot in this picture. And they're all wearing the same kind of hat, except for this guy right here. But they got about 100 different ways to wear the same hat. And here's TR himself. He's got the blue wool shirt on. He doesn't have the big jacket on. But you can see the polka dotted neckerchiefs right here. Here's one here, and here's one around TR's neck. The diversity of the Rough Riders is interesting enough that their regimental adjutant, Tom Hall, wrote a kind of poem about them, describing who was in the Rough Riders. And the poem says, rich man, poor man, Indian chief, doctor, lawyer, not one thief, merchant, sheriff, artist, clerk, clubman, quite unused to work, miner, ocean gondolier, broker, banker, engineer, cowboy, copper, actor, mayor, college athletes, and men of prayer. So they pretty much try to include every imaginable person in this. By copper, they mean, of course, police officer. And there were few police officers who volunteered to be in the Rough Riders because they remembered TR from when he was commissioner of the New York City Police Department. And they wanted to go and fight in the war with him. Yeah, it was a pretty interesting mix of guys, rich guys, poor guys, you name it. Everybody was in it. And they didn't all go in there and say, well, I'm from a wealthy family. I want to be an officer. No, they just wanted to join. And you had cowboys and then the sons of wealthy New Yorkers, Columbia University graduates, Harvard graduates, Yale graduates, and they all serving in the same outfit, same regiment. Well, his experience with the Rough Riders was very important in making Roosevelt who he was. He wrote a book about it, which I actually think is better than most people give it credit for. He talks about his time in the Rough Riders in that book. As a former Rough Rider, he would regularly attend Rough Rider reunions for as long as he was able to, and they had him for quite some time. Somebody asked if he joined because did they join because they were bored? Not always. Like I said, there were different reasons for joining. Some wanted to, some might have been bored and wanted an adventure. Some wanted to be with Theodore Roosevelt. They thought it'd be the right thing to do historically. So different motivations. It varied from person to person. The Rough Riders had regular reunions. There was a standing policy with Roosevelt when he was president. Any Rough Rider who came to the White House and wanted to talk to him, he would certainly go and talk to them. They could knock on the door and say, "I'm a Rough Rider. I want to see the president," and in they would go. He remembered most of the guys he served with. Roosevelt had incredible memory, and served him well for sure. Meantime, for Roosevelt himself, as a Rough Rider, he became very famous and what we would say electable. In other words, his fame was so much that when people saw his name on a ballot, they would vote for him. And because of that, right after the war, he was talked into running for governor of New York State and became governor of New York State. For a very short time only, because right after that, he was nominated vice president for William McKinley's second term. Unfortunately, very quickly into McKinley's term, he would be shot at an exposition in Buffalo and die from those wounds. And well, then Theodore became president. But 3.5 years later, when he ran himself in an election, he was easily elected. So still very popular, very electable. He would eventually be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, but not until January 16th of 2001, 103 years after the war, he was recognized for his bravery. Now, it's probably because of politics. Other people who fought in the Spanish-American War were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. The first Medal of Honor given out in the White House was given out by Roosevelt, and it was awarded to a lieutenant who was a field surgeon in the Rough Riders. But the process of being nominated for that honor involved a lot of Army and a lot of Army paperwork, and the Army didn't always get along with TR, and some might say he didn't get that award for 103 years because well, they were a little angry at him still. I don't know, but he did get what I think is a very deserved honor. If you read about his actions in that very short time, he was an incredibly brave man and did some amazing things for sure. So that's our Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. We got any questions? It would be super. I love answering questions. It teaches me about what you're interested in, and I learned stuff today already. So I'm certainly open to more questions. Why did the Rough Riders end up at Montauk after the fighting? Good question. When the fighting ended in Cuba, there was some time where they were concerned about, how we're going to get guys back to the United States. There were cases of malaria and yellow fever being spread among the soldiers because of the nature of the environment in Cuba. And they didn't want to just bring a shipload of guys with yellow fever back to New York Harbor and let them off in Brooklyn. So the decision was made to set them up in a quarantine camp away from crowded places. And at the time, Montauk was pretty far away from crowded places. So the Rough Riders were put on a ship brought back from Cuba, dropped off in Montauk, and they stayed there for a while until they were mustered out of service. Why was the war so poorly planned? The war, it seemed kind of rushed for sure. From what I've read, as a country, the history of conflict. I work at Governor's Island in the summertime. We talk a lot about the Army. Uh, Traditionally, up until at least World War II, we never kept a very large army in service in the United States. As soon as the conflict was over, we would send everybody home. There would be a very small group of soldiers left in case we needed them, but otherwise, we didn't keep large standing armies around. And when that conflict starts, there's a real rush to get troops in. There's a rush to get them trained. And, you know, when you rush things, things aren't always done right. No one had fought a war, on that scale since 1865. So some guys were out of practice. It was just you know, bad planning, rushed, and it showed in a lot of ways. Did some Rough Riders take part in his funeral? I'm sure there was some that attended. His funeral wasn't very large. If you search Library of Congress, there's actually a film that was taken at his funeral. He was buried out of a church in Oyster Bay. It's still there. I've been to that church a number of times. It's a beautiful little church. And if you watch the film, you know, when you look at a presidential funeral these days, you almost always see military personnel as the honor guard. If you watch the film of his funeral in 1919, very cold January day, his honor guard were police officers from New York City. It was a very humble affair. If you ever get a chance to visit his grave, it's in a very small town cemetery in Oyster Bay Cove. Sits right outside the front gate of Sagamore Hill. Okay, we have a link to that film. There you go. That's pretty cool. Thanks, Teresa.